Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire, here today to discuss with you the Western Front, particularly from the British perspective. And what we're really going to focus on in this short series of videos is a continuation of the immediate causes series that we covered in our lesson earlier in the week. Now, this one, of course, will consider how the war transformed from that war movement to attrition in 1914. As always, it's important to stress that this lesson is catered towards students, and so the context will provide some key knowledge and provide you a chance to practice your historical skills. We are historians after all, and our goal is to put our knowledge to the test and put it into practice. So, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. Now, it's important before we move on is to stress and understand what the Western Front actually is. Because again, this could be our first time going through it, and so we want to make sure we understand. Now, the Western Front, just in general terms, was this 400-mile long stretch of land, and it weaved through France and Belgium. And these were the main theatre of the war for these nations, including England, on the western side of the World War front. And so this is the main theatre that the people who believe in it described as Westerners, who believed this was the most important theatre in the war, and indeed where the conflict could and should be won between 1914 and 1918. Now, when we talk about movement, we're talking about how the forces were mobilized. We should hopefully remember from our last lesson that the countries were preparing for war. They had their reserve forces, they were transporting armies, and they were moving to areas that they thought would be likely areas for attack and organizing their supply and command systems. However, this idealized movement of fast action and a victory within as short as 6 weeks and home by Christmas was actually going to transform into attrition. And attrition is this belief that actually we're going to have to work down the enemy's forces over time by constant attack and pressure, and that breakthroughs and grand victories were not absolutes and not going to be easy to achieve. Why indeed was this the case? Why were they believing that this war of movement was going to stay? Well, this is where we should recall what happened in our last lesson. So we should, of course, remember this, a quick recap on the five main reasons for what immediately caused the war in 1914. And the five ones we covered are, of course, on the screen. You should hopefully remember these. Remember Princip and the Archduke and our alliance systems that spiraled out and led to the conflict blowing out into a full European and eventually a world war. What we're going to focus on in the last 2 points, which is Schlieffen Plan and how England got itself involved in the war. We're going to expand on this more today and consider it in more detail. As said, it's important to remember that many military strategists, when they enacted the Schlieffen Plan, believed it was going to be a very quick war of movement over in 6 weeks. And especially for the Germans, they'd had previous success against defeating France quickly when they were Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And so they thought now they had an alliance with Austria-Hungary that they were going to easily win. They were going to have an easy time going over north, going over, attacking through Belgium and taking northern France. But as we established, attacking Belgium was not a good thing because it enabled England and the wider British Empire to get involved in the conflict and provide trouble. So we should quickly go over why the Schlieffen Plan actually failed and why suddenly this conflict was going to have to last longer than the idealized 6 weeks. As we said, von Schlieffen had made this plan and it accounted for some Belgian resistance. But the plan was made in 1905, and so that's several years before Schlieffen himself had died already in 1913. And so this belief that it was going to be a swift victory was probably going to be outdated. It relied on this, and we can remember from our session last time, this big right flank maneuver all the way over left, over here, taking Belgium, rushing over and encircling Paris. However, the reality was not to be. As we said, Germany was hoping this was going to work. As we established, they were in this two-front war with respective France and Russia. They, of course, felt vulnerable because although they had Austria-Hungary, there was still Serbia to deal with, and two fronts splitting your forces is quite difficult. You should hopefully remember my schoolyard brawl comments and how if someone was attacking you on the left-hand side, you could be rushed in and sucker punched from the right. That's why it's very dangerous to get involved in fights when you're not quite sure who the enemy actually may be around you. So Germany was quite simply outnumbered. That they were going to have to get through two nations to do this to win this war. And of course, there's rough figures. They were roughly 5-3 at a disadvantage. So it was very key that they fight France, defeat her in 6 weeks, and they could turn all their forces and quickly defeat Russia as well, this time with Austro-Hungarian support ready for a solid counterattack. However, by pushing and attacking through Belgium, they faced more resistance than they believed. We're not going to cover in this detail the Battle of Liege in detail and the main resistance we uncovered, but as my punch image from last lesson showed, the young child giving that response, hitting back with the stick, despite how big and muscly the German may have been, was something that the Germans did not expect. And now, in their efforts to bypass the French border here with all its defences and fortifications from Verdun upwards and south. Suddenly, the attack here in Belgium was taking longer than they thought, and getting into France and achieving this encirclement was becoming more and more unlikely. The second reason, of course, they faced problem was not only because England was rushing in, but because they now had supply issues. Despite being a relatively well industrialized nation, they actually lacked enough reserves and trains. They had 5,000 cars and about over 1 million horses to transfer their goods and supplies and guns, but it wasn't quick enough. It wasn't going to be enough for a swift victory. They even relied on pigeons for messages because, of course, radios and telephones they were using were not yet reliable. And indeed, as bombing and counterattacks were being met, it was quite likely that bombs would destroy the telephone lines and make crossing the border and so forth on the land becoming even tougher. It also, they say, did not help that Russia proved to be a lot faster in mobilizing than they expected. They moved a lot quicker. They suddenly began launching attacks on the eastern side, and Germany was going to have to respond. Although we're not going to cover the details of the Eastern Front in this series, we are going to consider that Germany was facing its own problems and even responding to it. In Bavaria, the troops under Prince Ruprecht's command were quite hesitant and to actually move and take command from Kaiser Wilhelm II to actually move and transfer to the Eastern Front. There was a lot of tension between those subsections and regions within wider Germany, mostly owing to the religious differences, Protestantism, Catholicism, and various other sections. And of course, their hesitancy perhaps cost the Germans a significant advantage. And the final part to note is maybe it is indeed just too ambitious. That this Schlieffen planet was a pipe dream, 6 week victory. It was going to be a massive lightning strike through, and it would have a massive success. But it was not to be. And the truth really is, they just did not have the supplies and the means for such a quick form of warfare. This would not be the case in the Second World War and a different move through the Ardennes, but in this conflict in World War One, it indeed failed. So now we get on to what, of course, happened after Britain lands and begins responding to this invasion attack that the Germans have been placing on. As always, I always think it's good to rely on and get some information first from our primary sources. So we have here some extracts that came through from the German Army headquarters in August 1914. We have here the Battle of the Mons that's being mentioned, which of course occurred in August 23rd. So, feel free now to pause the video, have a read through yourself of these 3 short extracts, and try and practice independently that inference skill we talked about last lesson. As a quick reminder, what we're talking about with inference is before we learn any major context, can we just gather some understanding from what is in the source? I'll quickly discuss the first one for you. So have a read first, have a quick pause. Good, all read. So something we should point out for you straight away is this idea that the British was entrenched and completely hidden. So we can infer from this is a clear use of stealth tactics by the British that was being played here. They were putting this into this idea of a surprise attack onto the German forces and giving them problems. So that's one inference idea we could indeed get from it. That maybe surprise and stealth was a key tactic the British were using successfully. Of course, pause again, have a read through the other extracts. I'll quickly have a comment for you in a moment. Very good. We'll bring it back together and have a quick discussion of those other 2 extracts. So the first, or the second one in this case, we're going to look at is, of course, the idea that reports were coming in that the British were in front. And we can gather from this an attitude the German soldiers had actually in both sources. So in the second one, it turns out the Germans were initially joking about the British forces. They were underestimating them. And in source 3, with a similar thing, they were beaten by the English. They were laughing about them hours before. So we can put these together and understand that a surprise attack had come about and caused massive success for the British and indeed had taken the Germans by surprise. Again, the second source notes the men were chilled to the bone. We can gather from that quite scared, quite fearful. They were now exhausted, and they were facing the depressing consciousness of defeat weighing upon them. So suddenly, as we said, the Schlieffen Plan was failing. The Germans had their backs down, and they were suffering and struggling quite a lot. The British were really giving it to them, and being a confident force and taking it against them. So it's important to now point this out with some context as well, and really bring some detail to what we've talked about here. So this is going to cover, as I say, the Battle of Mons and the consequences thereupon that, of course, occurred. So first off, when we're talking about the British soldiers illustrated here, and actually we're talking at this stage about a British expeditionary force. We should remember from our last video that Britain was a massive empire worldwide at this point in 1914, and that empire was achieved mainly because of its vast and powerful Royal Navy. Well, despite the Navy's success, you still need a landing force, soldiers to take on and then occupy the nations that you've attacked. And that's where the British Expeditionary Force, or the BEF for short, come in. Now, they were a much smaller force. The force that was deployed into France was only around 80 to 90,000 strong. And in total, the whole thing was only around 120,000 on the home front and with territorial forces. This is quite a small force compared to the German army's own, which could, at its peak, be mounted to around 900,000 or 1 million at this stage in 1914. And so the British, as we said, they did indeed conduct a dramatic counter-attack and took the Germans by surprise at Mons. They hid and they shot and they fired their guns, and the Germans struggled. They really struggled to take the houses, take the streets. But the British were indeed the smaller force, and this did indeed backfire on them. They eventually were becoming overwhelmed in the attack, and they had to retreat to avoid total annihilation. They themselves could not launch a counterattack and do their own kind of Schlieffen plan and reverse an attack and take on Germany and get to Berlin. They had to retreat to avoid this annihilation, because indeed a big problem they suffered was a right flank was coming, and indeed it was exposed because the French were also on the retreat. And so to retreat from Mons, the British had to march around 200 miles in 13 days from the initial attack. It was a big retreat, and they gave up a lot of space as they made their way all the way back to Paris to avoid, and of course, outright defeat, really, and outright annihilation. And this was a major blow for the British, and we can see here on the image on the left that it actually was a psychological blow for the British as well. So we can see that, of course, the British soldiers were wounded, they were damaged, but of course, they were also psychologically burdened. You might be wondering, who are these angels? What are they? Well, there were reports from British soldiers that as they were marching this 200-mile stretch at continuous pace, they were marching through the night, marching without break. Many of the time, they they suffered essentially hallucinations, and they believed that angels at Mons had come and rescued them and saved them, and that they had saved them from the Germans, who were very hot on their tail and chasing them at every way they could, artillery bombardments, charging attacks, trying to take up that space the British and also the French were giving up. And so the British were exhausted. These angels, as far as we can tell, were not real. Of course, there are debates on this, but the general belief is they were hallucinating. And so this was really a big defeat. This retreat was a loss for the British. And actually, there was response back home. There was initial censorship by the government, who did not really want to reveal to their people, the sons, to the sons' own mothers and fathers, and of course their brothers and sisters, that potentially the the defense was going to fail and the Germans were going to defeat them. And indeed, actually, it was a whole week before they dared to report that the retreat was occurring and that British soldiers were going to get back to Paris safely. And indeed, there was actually some criticism that came out in many newspapers. One notable extract from the Times, released in August 30th, argued the government should call on more men, more men. The Germans are outnumbering the British, and a large fighting force must become preferable to the smaller, if higher trained and better quality one that the British expeditionary force matched. There was a dream the rapid movement was going to win the war, but it was not going to happen, and maybe a longer, more attritional style war was the only option that they had for now. And this, of course, is what was going to happen. But this was not going to happen quite so yet. We will cover the expeditionary force and how that expanded to include power battalions in a future video. But for this one now, we're going to focus on the resulting stalemate that came about from the retreat. So as said, the Allies they'd rested up and they'd restored themselves, and they launched a counterattack at the River Marne in September 1914, the very next month. And this battle of the Marne was quite successful. It pushed the Germans back and got some more space. Exhausting though, both sides began to dig trenches to shelter and protect themselves. The Germans and Allies, they of course began what's called an outflanking campaign, or what's called the race to the sea, which essentially was them trying to really take and outmatch the other wherever they could, try and get some ground and achieve another breakthrough and gain some progress. And this resulted in the Germans attacking the very northern town of Ypres here in Belgium. So that you imagine they've travelled all the way up from the southern front, right through the Marne, all the way down here. They progressed all the way up through the Mons, and suddenly, as this constant crisscrossing and zigzagging has ended here at Ypres. Why is this so important? Well, if the Germans take this area, suddenly they actually have a landing port here. They get access to the northern ports, and suddenly can actually cut off more supply lines for the British. The British, yes, they had their navy, but they were still reliant to supply the Belgians and French from the northern border. If the Germans could take that, it would be a massive victory and a very big morale blow for the British. And so the first Battle of Ypres occurred in October 19th, all the way up to November 22nd in 1914. It was quite dogged fighting, quite graphic, but it failed. The British and French, despite suffering around 100 to 150,000 casualties, managed to fight them off and got another draw, another stalemate. And this, as winter was setting in as we enter November into December, it meant that both sides were ending on the defensive. We found ourselves a stalemate that actually finished or started here at the Channel coast and was going to stretch all the way down, right down through France, all the way into Switzerland. And that was the situation. That was the stalemate that 1914 ended itself in. So we have to kind of bring it all together really and get our summative reasons for the stalemate and its occurrence. As we said, this all started with the Schlieffen Plan. The Germans went for that attack, went for that gamble, but it ultimately failed. The British got involved, Belgians put up that resistance, and of course, the success at the Mons as well. They avoided annihilation despite the initial exhaustion that's placed on the British force. They managed to retreat and launch that counterattack at the Marne. And through that, they achieved the race to the sea and, of course, held them off at Ypres and managed to get the stalemate on the Western Front. We can't forget that on the eastern side, the Russians were doing their bit too. They were mobilizing quite rapidly and indeed were providing some very significant resistance for the Germans and splitting their forces. And of course, this trouble should not be forgotten about. As I said, although we're not going to focus on the Eastern Front in this series, we are focusing on how, at this stage, the stalemate did occur for the Western Front. And indeed, splitting the forces of the Germans is a reason we can't really overlook. But of course, you are the historian. You are the historians here. And so, which one do you find the most convincing? Was it the Germans? Was it the British? Was it the Russians? Or maybe it's the combination of all three, as we established with this triple entente finally coming together, getting through the animosities and issues, coming and really being an allied force. That actually, three nations is a lot stronger than one, and Germany hadn't really accounted for that, and the failures they'd faced indeed do reveal that. As said, this of course has been the first part in a series here on the Western Front, focusing on the British perspective. And you see, you haven't seen my earlier videos on the immediate causes, do of course check them out. They of course will give you some more detail. We are going to go into the military history and the conflict here on out. So if you're more here for the political and side of that, do go back to the previous videos and of course focus on them. But of course, thank you for watching this first part here. I hope you found it quite insightful. Do check out the next part in the series where we're going to go over the trench warfare in particular, how we transition into this war of attrition, and again focusing on that British perspective and the conflicts therein. It's been History with Sire. I hope you found this useful. I look forward to seeing you in my class for the lesson again. Thank you.